Hey Phils, so if you follow me for the long time actually, so you know that I keen on the knowledge graphs and AI agents, and I building the memory for the agent, and I wrote so many articles about how to model it, and for sure I have the tons of articles about the time, and time is crucial for the understanding. Yeah, and we have a lot of things around the time, and from the philosophical thing, like what time is, and different studies and different sciences see the time differently. But today we'll talk about the knowledge graph and time, and memory and time. And for sure, the time in a human memory, it's quite complex constructive process where the hippocampus help us to create the timeline. But we not go this deep because then it's deserved uh, separate video, So I wrote the article about the evolution of the knowledge graph, and if you will take a look to the evolution of the knowledge graphs deeply, you will see that this topic also about time, because first we have the study graphs, the the big graphs of encyclopedical knowledge, and that's it, and it was good enough. Then we realized that we need to update the information in these knowledge graphs, and then we get to the dynamic graphs where we just update this study graph all the time with the new data. And at some point of time, we realized that when we update and we forget the previous states, actually, um, we lose the information. And we realized that if we will add the timestamps and the validities and all other things to the knowledge graph, items like the ages and nodes, we will get a lot of benefits from the memory perspective and all the things. And then it's the new emerging field appear for the knowledge graphs. It's the temporal graphs. We have the temporal graphs, we have the temporal networks, we have all the things. And they differ because you could have these temporal spatiographs that are stable, but they change the properties. But they not change how the graph is wired, and vice versa. You could have this fully dynamic graph that have this edges that have the validity and all the thing. And yeah, so the temporal graphs was the big move to bring in the time uh, as a you know as a value in a graph. And then we realized that we not always have this timestamp, we not always have this validity pairs and all the things. And at some point we realized that the events that happens also deserve to be in a graph, and we get to the latest stage actually of evolution of the graphs for now. It's the event graphs, when together with the entities you have the events, and events connected to the entities, but they describe some changes. And sometimes you could even use the events as a to capture the changes in the structure of the graph, that you say that something is happens and we change this to that. And they have a lot of articles about this entity state models and all the things, how to capture the changes in the graph itself. But it's yet another big topic that you could read my article. And why it's matter for the memory, because uh, when you don't have the notion of the time, and your agency everything as now, yeah, and or it's not distinguish the time, and we find a lot that our brain have the similar flaw, but um flaws, yeah. So and yeah, so the problem is that some information needs to be time tagged, because some information is not valid anymore. Some facts, for example, even the fact that the Berlin is the capital of Germany, actually, have some periods that it was not true because it was born and so on. And with this temporal or bitemporal models. We have a lot of approaches. You could have a lot of my articles, and one of the most promising solution for now is graffiti that actually use these validity pairs that you have the start and end where the entity appear and entity was valid, and it's cover huge amount of use cases. But unfortunately, what I have learned over the time that this approach not always work. And why it's not always working? First of all, yeah, our time is global, and I do not want to get crazy and say that we have the multiple timelines. But in practice, in our life, we have the multiple lifespans and multiple timelines, especially in the work experience, because some events actually create the durable timelines. Like I'm working at Keen a couple of years ago, I was working at Affinity. I have my personal life, I have the marriage and all the things, and they somehow create this dark structure of the timelines that have the influence on each other. And what's more interesting that if we talking about the swarm intelligence, where we start interacting with the different agents, we have our own preservation of the time, but that other people maybe have the different, and we have the integrated plot of the lifespans of the people, but still they independent, and somehow we have this huge stack of the lifespans and timelines of the different people in the different contexts, and they have multi-dimensional space that still depict the same time, and it's quite fascinating idea actually. So and it's mean that we don't have the single validity, and sometimes the timestamp need more context to understand on which um, context and on which lifespan we talking about. And it's create a lot of complexity, but the biggest complexity why graffiti do not work well, that in a conversational agents, when you have the agent that user talk about and all the things, and you extracting the memory from the conversations that a lot of people do nowadays. People quite rarely say that I will do something on the 1st of May, 10, so 45 or something like that. So in the best case, they say that I will do something tomorrow or I will do something next week. And even in the next week, you already have the interval because you could not count the 7 days from now. Yeah, it's mean that somewhere from the next week, from Monday to Sunday, probably something will happen, and it's mean that you need some kind of smart reasoning or the another artificial intelligence model that actually will be able to convert such statements to the intervals. And it's mean that we have a lot of interval driven time that we could calculate with some precision. So if I will say that in the next month I need to do the physiotherapy, if we have the interim months, and yeah, and it could be tricky, and still it's potential events, but let's not talk about the probability here. Let's focus on the time. So we usually have some potential intervals where the events could happen. So we move from the concrete date that easy to the intervals that are potential, and then the next level of complexity in a conversational agents and time when people say that, we need to have a kids soon, or we say that I need to fix my bike soon, or I need to, drop smoking soon, quit smoking soon. Yeah, and soon it's abstract thing. So we don't know the concrete interval. And in terms of fixing the bike, it could be then next week. But in terms of having the kids, it could be in a couple of years. I don't know. It's up to the person. And this abstract time actually, it's an interesting concept itself, because we still could create some useful processing buckets that we need to pay attention to something that we call soon, but we need to be aware. And yet another quite dangerous abstract times like soon, because soon is a subset of future. And we have the near future, far future, and all other things, because the past is easy. Past never changed, the past never became something else. But the future could become the past quite fast, you know, and that's why we have this, you know, complexity of the human language that could depict the time from the constant timestamps to the some weak intervals to extremely weak um, temporal context that require the interpretation and clarification. But it's not the end of the game, because we just talk about the time. But we could also talk about the events, and events are also some kind of temporal anchors. What I mean, that I will eat the ice cream when I will finish my lunch. And it's also the temporal relations, because you say that you will do something after or before or during or whatever. So it's mean that you don't have the timestamp, but you have the event that define the time period. And it's yet another temporal dimension and temporal relation, that you could have the events instead of timestamps, but the events could have the timestamps. So it's mean that we could have the chains or dots of such events that have the concrete timestamps that could define the time of something in the future, or maybe even something in the past. So we could say that I start working as a developer while I was studying a university, the second year of my university or something like that. And then you have the event that you graduate the university in this year, and you could infer the date, right? So it's some complex relation between the events. And the most interesting that, you know, the events sometimes itself it's not enough, because it depends how we see the things. If we're talking about some complex life experience that formed in our brain from multiple events, then we have yet another temporal relation, like the life experiences or memories. So when I moved to Berlin, and you could have a lot of events that related to the move of Berlin, that also will have some kind of temporal interval. And you see that from the timestamps, we move to the time intervals, then we move to the abstract time, then we move to the events and complex memories that could also point to the time. And it's not the end of the game, actually. So, yet another thing that you could have the life experiences that have the repeatable nature. So every Friday I go to the party, or I have the physiotherapy twice a week, and all of things. And it's also quite interesting patterns, because it could happen, it could not happen. It's schedule it and all the things, and you need to reflect all this stuff in a memory space. And unfortunately, from what I observe currently in all the memory systems, they don't have this rich temporal context that we could use for to describe all the things. That's why we building our own memory. So that's it. See you next time.